Hey, so welcome everybody. There's almost no better feeling than hope. Tonight we welcome Brent Botros. Brent's life began in North Carolina, but his path to his recovery took him to Treehouse in Costa Mesa, California, and then ultimately back to his hometown of Willington, North Carolina, where he now serves his community as the program director of Treehouse, North Carolina. We've asked Brent to speak with us tonight about his amazing journey into his recovery. And with that, we're going to let Brent introduce himself and begin sharing his story of hope with us. Brent, welcome, and we're eager to hear from you, and the floor is all yours.
All right. Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for inviting me to join in tonight. Yeah, I just want to say I appreciate this organization a lot and what you guys are doing. So, so yeah, I grew up in Wilmington, North Carolina, kind of going back to childhood a little bit. My dad's a doctor, my mom's a nurse. My dad moved here from Egypt when he was 16 and met my mom in medical school. And I've got one older brother. My parents had three girls in between my brother and I, that all passed away as babies. I don't think any of them made it beyond the age of one. So from a really early age, they, I think, wanted to give me the world and protect me. And so, kind of fast forwarding a little bit, before high school, I was always kind of a wild kid. And, you know, given the fact that I kind of had that sense of my parents trying to protect me and limit me at times, I think just because they wanted to keep me safe, I began to become pretty rebellious in nature. And, unfortunately, once I got into high school, that kind of found its way into drugs and alcohol. Started out just, normal high school drinking on the weekend, partying, and stuff like that. And then, once I met a few friends that were experimenting with other things and pills, cocaine, other other party drugs. I started dabbling around with that a little bit, and then found out that my mom was prescribed oxycontin. So during high school, I would steal her oxy and do that along with other things too. And right around the time that I graduated from high school, toward the end of summer, my cocaine issues started to take off. And I had, you know a few weeks before going to college where things started to get pretty bad for me. And I was hanging out at my house one night with a few friends doing some coke downtown or downstairs. And I didn't realize it, but my dad was upstairs with the sheriff of Wilmington at the time, who he confided in. And he kind of reached a point where he didn't know what to do. And that sheriff at the time had a son that was struggling with addiction. So he thought that that was really the only person that he could talk to and get advice from. So I ended up walking out to my truck, started the truck. I didn't go anywhere. And I was about to smoke a joint in the truck with one of my friends. And within a few minutes, I turn around and there was six sheriff deputies, I think, give or take, in my driveway that pulled up, pinned me in, had me get out of the truck, walked me up to, the front porch where I saw my sheriff and my parents at the front door about to walk out. And the sheriff looked at me and he said, "You're going to get everything out of the house and hand it to me, or I'm going to send the dogs in and get it." So I did that. I gave him everything. And then shortly after that, just went into a rage and started destroying things in the house. Then I ended up packing a bag, left for the night, went back, later on that night, around 2, 3 in the morning, And then the next morning I agreed to go see a psychiatrist. And I'd never really I didn't really understand addiction or alcoholism at the time. And for me, I thought that maybe I just let the wheels fall off the track for a brief period, but I didn't have a serious problem. And the psychiatrist told me that he he thought I should go to treatment. Well, I ended up storming out of there, cussed him out, and then once I got out of his office, I had a few conversations with my parents and agreed to go try out this outpatient program, Wilmington Treatment Center here in Wilmington. And I showed up there, and during my intake, I stepped out for a second and was immediately met by a sheriff who put me in handcuffs and took me to the hospital, handcuffed me to the hospital bed. They took my blood, and then the next day I didn't really know what was going on, but I was being involuntarily committed, and they ended up putting me in shackles, put me in the back of an armored sheriff's van. They didn't tell me where I was going, and they took me to a detox center in Greenville, North Carolina, where that was my first exposure to what addiction looked like, what treatment looked like, and it put a sour taste in my mouth. I, given my rebellious nature and just the fact that none of that was my decision, put a lot of resentment and anger in me, which, I got out of there and convinced my parents to let me continue to pursue college. And a few days later, I packed up, got ready for college, got to college. I went to East Carolina University for a few years. And I did really well my first term. I was in the mechanical engineering program. I was on the dean's list. And granted, I was going out every night just about and partying. And then toward the end of my second year in college, my drug usage continued to get worse. I started doing a lot more opiates, a lot more oxy, and on top of a lot of other things too. But that was really my primary drug of choice. And then there was a night where I hurt my ankle pretty bad, broke one of my toes. I stumbled down the stairs, and then the next morning I showed up at the student health center, and I convinced them to write me a prescription for a certain amount of oxy, and then they gave me a low amount, so I decided to scribble out the amount that they wrote and changed it to a different amount, tried to turn it in, ended up getting arrested for prescription fraud and forgery. And then my parents decided to bail me out of jail. They came up to Greenville, picked me up, took me back home, and at that point I completely dropped out of college. And I ended up moving back in with them, and that was around 20 years old. And I've been sober for 7.5 years. I left North Carolina when I was 23. I'm 30 now. And so between 20 and 23 was when things started to get really bad for me. I was living at my parents' house, kind of rewinding for a second. So the first week that I got back to their house, within a matter of days, I ended up snorting about 16 milligrams of Subutex and was already on about 15 milligrams of Xanax. And that night, I remember being in my room and everything just went dark for a second. And my eyes opened for a split second. I saw the paramedics come into my room, and I was overdosing. And they got me to the hospital. Luckily, kept my heart from stopping completely, which according to my dad, it was pretty close. So then at that point, I agreed to go back to Wilmington Treatment Center. I spent 30 days in there, and then once I got out, I moved into a sober living house. At that point, I kind of realized, I started to realize I had an issue that maybe needed a little bit more attention. So I was a little bit more open and willing at that point to accept and take help. So I spent that time in Wilmington Treatment Center, got out. I was in the sober living for probably a month maximum, and I ended up getting kicked out of there for drinking, and then I ended up moving back in with my parents after manipulating them into thinking that the sober living was just not a healthy environment for me. So they gave in and let me move back in with them. And then right around that time, one of my friends introduced me to a few gang members who, by this time I had started uh, doing heroin. So I got introduced to these guys, began selling heroin for them, doing heroin a lot, and at the same time I had started a membership on a dark website, was ordering drugs to be shipped to my parents' house through that. So I, I'm spending a lot of time with these gang members, driving into the projects in downtown Wilmington, selling for them, robbing people, getting robbed. That was kind of what my life had turned into. And around 2022, probably about 6 months before I left Wilmington, I ended up taking a few of these guys back to my parents' house around 3, 4 in the morning. And my mom woke up, came downstairs, saw a few of these guys. One of them was a convicted murderer, not the best looking guys in the world. She panicked. I got kicked out of the house, and for about a week I was living in hotel rooms, motel rooms, off Market Street in Wilmington. And I, kind of, I ran out of money at this point, reached a point of desperation, and I ended up going back over to my parents' house. I kicked in one of the doors, broke in, and then about an hour later, my mom came back home, found me on the ground. I had overdosed on heroin. I think she gave me Narcan because I immediately got up in a rage and was just in a full blown panic. And she was on the phone with the police, and I'm going around the house punching holes in the walls, tearing down any picture that I could find of myself in the house, just to, in my mind at the time, I was just so dead set on inflicting pain on them because I perceived that they were inflicting pain on me. So as she was on the phone, I heard her talking to the police, so I yelled out, "If they show up, I'm going to go grab Dad's gun and shoot them." So they ended up sending a SWAT team over to my parents' house. I ended up getting we kind of lived on a little island that had a one lane bridge in the marsh to get to, and there were other connecting neighborhoods that you could get to through the marsh. So I I scurried out of the house. I remember turning around and seeing guys with tactical gear and AR-15s circling the house looking for me, and I booked it, got away from them, had one of my friends pick me up in the neighborhood next to us, and I was over at his house for a little bit. They put me on the phone. They kept trying to call me and try to convince me to come back home. They kept saying that I wasn't in trouble, that they just wanted to help me. So I ended up going back there, and they, as soon as I got back, they're assuming I have a gun, I'm violent. They knew the type of people that I was hanging around. So they got me on the ground, put me in the back of the car, and then about 12 hours later, it was they put me in the back of an ambulance and drove me to a psych ward in South Carolina, where I was housed with, I would say, like 90, at least 90% mental health patients that were hearing voices and seeing things that weren't there. And me and maybe one or two other people that were there for addiction or substance use. So, they, at that point, I'd pretty much given up all hope. They tried to tell me that I needed to probably seek long-term treatment. And at that point, I was like, look, I'm not hearing what you guys are saying. So just, like, you're going to give me all my stuff after this detox stint is over. I'm going to leave and go back to exactly what I was doing before I got here, because I had just given up at that point. And so I got a taxi back to North Carolina. And once I got back, I was completely cut off by my parents. And they had sold the truck, changed all the locks on the house, cut me off financially. So then I packed up my bags, hopped on my scooter, and then, or my moped, and went over to one of my friend's houses, who let me move in with him for about 4 months. And I stayed there for about 4 months and some change. And that was right before I left North Carolina. And so he ended up kicking me out of his house because I was such a shit show over there that even he didn't want to have to manage it. So there was about a week to 2 week period where I was, couch surfing periodically once he kicked me out. There were a few nights that I stayed out in the woods, anywhere warm that I could find with shelter. And then it was about a week, no, about 2 weeks before I left, and I ended up trying to get back into my parents' house. I climbed up the second story balcony. I was about to throw a flower pot through the window and try to get in. And my dad pulled his gun out on me, and then cops showed up. They arrested me for trespassing, and I spent about a week and a half in jail for that. I got out. I, at that point, was begging for help. While I was in jail, I was issued 2 restraining orders from both my parents, and that was the reality that I needed. I think that's when things started to really sink in for me, that, like, this is what I'm doing to my parents. I'm burning all my bridges. I don't have anyone else or anything else in my corner, and something has to change. So I ended up getting a hotel for a few nights before leaving North Carolina, and I had agreed to seek a long-term treatment program. And I knew I wanted to get out of North Carolina because I just knew too many people over there, and it was not a good environment for me. So I'm staying in the hotel, still going over to my friend who kicked me out of his house. I was going over there nights until about 2, 3 in the morning, and then going back to the hotel and staying in the hotel. And there was one night where I knew that I knew I had a court date the next morning, which was the court date to determine if I was going to be able to leave North Carolina. Probation was going to allow it. And so I left my friend's house around midnight. And when I showed up to court the next morning, I was immediately met by a few homicide detectives who escorted me over to their office, and they told me that my friend had been shot and killed the night before in a robbery that went wrong. And I was there. For a while, I used to kind of I wouldn't say blame myself, but I had a lot of guilt for not being there, because I thought maybe if I had been there, I could have stopped it. And homicide questioned me for about 8 hours in their office because they didn't have the full witness information yet, and I think they were questioning me as a potential suspect. So that got cleared up, and then a few days later, I was on a plane out to California, and I went through one program before I found Treehouse, and I went through Treehouse for about for 5 months. Eventually, started working there. Saw something that saw and experienced something that worked for me, and then put my focus on that, and then eventually my that kind of became my purpose, was to help other people and help them through a way that worked for me, that I've seen work for a lot of other people, and then also kind of, I made it one of my bigger goals to eventually start a program in my hometown and come back here and repair some of the things that that I broke. And about 2.5 years ago, I ended up connecting with a local news agency here and helped them to develop a story on the opioid epidemic. And I got to that ended up turning into a town hall meeting. I got to sit in on or be a panelist in the town hall meeting with the mayor, the DA, the NC Attorney General, and speak about, you know, the epidemic and kind of where we're at right now and what isn't working, what needs to be changed. And I actually ended up becoming somewhat friends with the DA. And a few months later, me and him both went back to my high school here, and I got to tell my story. We kind of tag teamed a speech together, and me and him are pretty close now. So yeah, that's my story. I tried to make it quick so that I could give you guys some time for questions. So
Well, we don't want you to have to make it quick. We appreciate your sharing that with us, and it's so much of it rings true to all of us. So many things that you said are so similar to what we're going through. And while we're waiting for questions, y'all guys, you have to put them in chat. So if you have a question, but while we're doing that, I want to ask you a question, Brent, to get us started. One of the things that you said, well, there were many and I wrote them down, but I'm going to stick to this one. One of the things that I've always wanted to ask someone who knows, how easy is it on the dark web to get what you want?
if you have a membership, which is pretty easy if you know the right person or right people, you can get whatever you want from wherever you want across the world. And I don't mean just drugs. I mean like counterfeit money, counterfeit printing machines, organs, anything that you could think of, you can order from the dark web.
Well, we've all heard of it, but I don't know that I've ever met anybody who's used it. And so it's one of those things I guess you have to figure out how to do. And I know my son, he doesn't know how to use Cash App, so I don't think I have to worry about that. But so it is interesting to see somebody that's actually used it and to get a perspective on how easy it is to get things through that way. But thank you for that.
Yeah, of course.
Let's see. Okay, Nancy says, thank you for sharing your story. What is your relationship like with your parents today? And how can we support our recovering addicts?
It's great. So, but it took a while to repair. I didn't actually end up coming back home for a year and a half. And I remember when I did come back home, my parents, they didn't know who was going to be, like, what type of person was going to be getting off that plane. So they were scared. They hadn't obviously their last image in their head of me wasn't a good one. So they initially wanted to put me in a hotel for a few nights while I was visiting, but decided to take the risk, and they're glad they did. But at the same time, even if they had decided to put me in a hotel, I would have totally understood it. But it wasn't until 3 years down the road, having a conversation with my dad, that he told me that he could finally forgive me for everything.
Right. That's understandable. Okay, so Sue asked, she said, thank you so much for sharing some of your story with us. My question is it hard to relive some of the dark days you spoke about, like the script fraud or the gun incident at your parents or the loss of your friend?
I mean, I think every time I tell my story and get into those details, yeah, it does bring me back. And I kind of have to relive it a little bit, but I think I've redeveloped my relationship with my past, and I'm grateful for it because it led me to where I am today. So you know, I wouldn't I wouldn't change anything that happened in the past. You can't change anything. You can only change your relationship with it. Um,
Right,
so yeah, right now I'm grateful for everything that happened to me.
right. You've had a lot happening, that's for sure. Okay, so Kay says, thanks for sharing your story. I'd appreciate your thoughts on a situation with my son. He lost two jobs because of theft from employers, spent some time in jail, and is living with a girl now. She's basically supporting him. He can't get a job in the small town he's in because he has burned bridges. As a mom, it's so hard to not give him money for food, but for helping him in the past never helped him. I'm struggling to stay firm in my decision not to help him until he helps himself. Any advice?
I would just say stay the course, keep your boundaries, and um, I know for me personally, if I ever got any window of opportunity to manipulate or like get anything from my parents when I wasn't ready to receive it and I hadn't earned it for myself first, then that would just give me an opportunity to latch back on and use it in an unhealthy way. And it's if you're somebody who depends on that from other people, then when you receive it, then that kind of awakens the beast a little bit, in my opinion.
Right. And Nancy had a second part to her question. How can we support? How can we the best possible way support our recovering addicts?
Honestly, I think creating as much separation between you and them so that each person can heal on their own is is very important, in my opinion. I mean, that's a that's a question that could have a very long answer because I think there's a lot that we can do to support, but as much as we can be hands off and just focus on healing for ourselves, maintaining boundaries so that they can work through their own challenges and experience what those are going to be like, experience reality and dig their way out of it. I think like the beautiful part about people like us is like when we learn how to channel all of our demons in the right direction, they can become like some of our strongest assets.
Absolutely. I'm going to need you to call my son and tell him to stay away from me. So he's not so good at that separation. So, okay.
Yeah,
So Veggie says, can you share with us a moment that you faced a challenge or a craving and how you made it through that?
challenge or craving. So I know like during my first couple years, there were times where I would go out and be around alcohol, and the initial thought would pop up into my head, whether it be like comparing myself to other people or feeling judged for not drinking and just wanting to be a part of or wanting to be normal, that those thoughts would kind of creep in. And like for me personally, I think just like always bringing myself back to like the worst possible scenario and like the deepest, darkest pain that I felt, especially toward the end of my addiction, and knowing that if I play with that fire, then I'm risking everything that I experienced happening again. And then asking myself, am I willing to risk that? Which which side of life is better? Is it how I feel right now or how I felt back then? And playing the tape through.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so here is a question from Jen. How does a high functioning addict ever hit a bottom?
I think it's a personal choice. Everyone has a different bottom, and it's kind of up to the individual to decide when that bottom is. I heard a quote somewhere that said something like, never say you've hit rock bottom because you can always go lower. And I think that's true. You have to be able to take ownership over the fact that like the way that you're living right now is not working and something has to change.
Right, just get sick and tired of it all. Exactly. All right. How did you choose Treehouse? How did you find Treehouse?
So I went through one program in California for about a month and a half, and one of my case managers was adamant on me going to Treehouse, and she was basically like, you don't have any other options. Like this is what you're gonna do. You're a Treehouse guy, and she told me about it. Like, yeah, these guys they get up at 5 in the morning and do Navy SEAL style training on the beach, and I was like, I don't want to do that. Like that was my initial thought, but and and then I kind of slept on it, thought about it, and realized I needed to try something different. And and then actually Vecchi and a few other guys came and spoke to us while I was in that program. And at that point, I was already like dead set. I showed up. My hair was like my down to here at that point, and I had a wetsuit over my shoulders. And I raised my hand and I asked them if they were going to make me cut my hair.
Did
So
they?
that's how I Treehouse.
Did they cut your hair?
No, no.
Ah, okay, there you go. Good job. Oh,
Yeah.
all right. So Karen has a question slash comment. It's hard to do if you haven't gotten to the point of setting healthy boundaries yet, right? So she's working on it. What advice is there when we are in between?
Could I ask you a question? What what barriers do you think might be stopping you from setting healthy boundaries and maintaining them?
Right.
I'm just learning how to set them and deciding which ones to set. And I'm still fearful that, for example, if I don't answer the call, that it might be the call that I need to answer.
Yeah, that's tough. And especially I can't fully understand because I'm not a mom, but I can understand based on what my mom has been through. And it was the hardest decision that they ever made in their life was to draw the line in the sand and begin setting those boundaries with me. Not picking up the phone. My parents will attest to this day that even though it was the hardest decision that they ever made, they they had at that point they had to let go and let me run my own train into the ground. And I realized that by them continuing to engage with me was either way I was going to kill myself. That was going to happen, or I was going to run myself into the ground somehow. And the only difference was if they remained engaged with me, then maybe I would just do it in their house, but I would be way less likely to accept the reality that I needed to change. So,
Absolutely. Okay, so I have a question too, and then I've got a one for Vetchi also. One thing that you mentioned, Brent, was that you had your parents had started doing involuntary commitment for you,
mhm.
right? And how did that affect you? I know that's crossed my mind.
In the moment when it was actually happening, I was high. I was on drugs and I wasn't thinking clearly. So my immediate thoughts were that they were cornering me, attacking me, and just trying to make my life miserable. But after the drugs and alcohol cleared up out of my system, and I was able to sleep on it for a few nights and start to think a little bit more logically again, then I would come around. Usually, what would happen is I would apologize to them and, you know, begin to take a little bit more ownership over my behavior, which is what led to that. So, but it was hard. I mean, it put a lot of resentment and anger in my head for a few nights, but I would usually come around. But it did kind of spin my head against treatment for a while.
Mhm. Right. Okay, Vetchi, since we talked a minute ago about Treehouse and insurance and this and that, how to navigate, can you kind of give us some direction on how someone would find their way to Treehouse and financially navigate that through insurance and copays and what
Of
has to be
course.
done? Because that's a big obstacle for us.
So I'm going to be straight up with you guys. It's a mess. It really, really is. Insurance is doing everything they possibly can to pay as little as possible. And you're desperately trying to get care for your loved one. So my best piece of advice is to ask as many questions as you possibly can, not just to the facility that they're going to. If it's Treehouse and they have an amazing admissions department, you can get on there and you can ask any question you like, but also with your insurance as well. Like, get on the phone with them, ask them questions. You are their client. When somebody calls it's to their own insurance company and advocates for themselves and says, hey, this is the facility we're looking at. This is what we'd like to try to get done here. This is where, my loved one needs to go. I want you to cover this. I want to know how much of this you're going to cover. Those words coming from you guys speaks way louder than some third party calling and asking for billing information. It just weighs differently. They're going to listen to you guys way faster than they're going to listen to some outside treatment center. It is your insurance policy.
Mm.
Ask questions. Um, what will this cover? What won't this cover? How long will this last? Something that's really not taken into account, and it's one of the things that Treehouse has based itself on, is the longer care. This is not a problem that's solvable within 30 days. You're
Mm.
talking about rewriting condition response in the human brain. We're not just identifying negative behaviors, teaching somebody how to go from like using their left hand to their right hand just as fluid as they normally would, and they've been doing their whole lives, takes a period of time. So when you look at care, look at extended care. There isn't a person in the treatment industry who won't tell you that the longer someone can stay, the better they're going to do. It's more practice with those new skills. And you know what? Not everybody can stay at the best place for the longest period of time, but there's other avenues. There's sober living environments. There's the Phoenix. There's communities. There's AAs. Get in there and advocate for every moment possible you can get in treatment and in a group for your loved one. And they'll hear
Right.
you. They will. They will absolutely hear
Right.
you. You guys carry way more weight with your voices than we do. We've had insurance companies hang up on us, tell us we're not, we won't even talk to you. This is it, and that's that. And I've had a mom get on the phone, and I don't know what she said, but man, their attitude was different when I talked to them next. So might have been a Tam's mom. I don't know. She got, you tell somebody they're not going to get
Well,
their
you need
child
to
taken
find her
care
name and number for us.
of. um,
Well, Betsy, what about, we have a lot of adult children who
mm,
it's kind of how you label, but they don't have insurance, right?
mm,
So in that scenario, do you have a suggestion on how to navigate that with somebody who has no insurance?
If they don't have insurance, it depends on state to state, and as things are moving on, legislation is changing. They can get different policies depending on where they're at. There's Medicaid programs, there's Medicare programs. It's all about knowing your resources. Like if somebody calls in, we get them resources no matter what. I'm on the streets, I have no resources, I don't know where to go. Okay, what city are you in? What state are you in? What county are you in? How old are you? What services are you searching for? And we will pull up a whole list of here's your resources. I did not get to go to a fancy place. I went to an indigent men's detox. I moved into Treehouse when it was just housing, and that's where I started. So it can be done. Don't lose hope just because they can't get, the best of the best or one or the other. It's possible out there, but please argue, advocate for yourselves and your insurance companies. Advocate for the best care possible. Call the treatment center and ask them what works best with you guys. What am I gonna what does this look like? What can I expect to see? What can they expect to see? What's not really covered? And if you got a good team on there, they'll bust their butt to make sure that door stays open.
Right, right. Well, thank you for that, Betsy.
And if I could
Tim,
just say real quick,
uh,
I've had the honor and privilege of watching Brent grow like from day one. I watched him help a lot of guys, and we grew from uncomfortable colleagues to friends, running on the beach in North Carolina, talking, sending horrible messages to each other at odd hours. It's been really, really cool to watch him grow and bring what he does back home.
we all are both phenomenal. And Betsy, we love your story. We love all you do for us and what you're doing for other people. And Brent, it's just a great honor to meet you and hear your story. I mean, what you shared with us is a lot of what we experienced, but you brought light to some other things that we haven't, to kind of awaken us and make us aware of things to look for. Do you have anything else you want to leave us with tonight? Any
Um,
advice, suggestions?
yeah, just stay close with each other. I think it's really important for you guys to band together, stay close, and help each other work through your own challenges that you're all experiencing related to your kids, your loved ones. So aside from that, if any of you guys ever need or want to chat, have any more questions, I'm here to help out.
No, we sure do appreciate that, Brent. And thank you for sharing your story and being here tonight. And you too, Betsy. We always appreciate it. And you've made a big difference to us. So we just want to thank you for that and for giving us your time.
Of course.
Thank you.